Hello. So, welcome. Tonight we'll talk about Provider. And for those who don't know me, I'm actually the author of Provider. And we will try to cover a bit of everything you will need to be able to use this library. So, a bit of history. A few months ago, during the Google I.O., the Flutter team made a talk named Pragmatic State Management in Flutter. It's definitely interesting, considering watching it if you haven't. And basically, the idea is it mentions things you should probably not do and suggested somehow to use Provider as a way to make scalable applications. But there's still some confusions on Provider remaining about, like, for example, what it is exactly or why you should use it. So tonight we will try to answer these questions together. We won't necessarily go on to how to make a full application. We will instead focus on what exactly is Provider and what's the benefits of using it. And then we'll see an overview on how to generally use it, with then followed by tips and tricks for a typical Flutter applications that people often wonder about. So, what is Provider? For a long time, Provider described itself as a mixture between dependency inheritance and state management. And while it's true, combined with the I.O. talk, it caused a lot of confusion for the community because state management is often associated with architecture, whereas Provider is not actually an architecture. It's not something comparable to Redux or whatever. It's instead more a tool. So that's not a good description. So we will officially somehow rebrand Provider to give it a more realistic description on what it does. The goal doesn't change, but the description does. So to describe Provider, I think one of the best explanation comes from Scott Stoll, another good member of the Flutter community, which says basically Provider is inherited widgets but for humans, which is kind of true because inherited widgets are very difficult to use in general, so basically Provider is officially now just inherited widgets easier. The goal doesn't change in the sense that you can still do service locators and dependency injection state management with it. It's just that it's clear that it's focused on inherited widgets. All right, so if we want to explain what Provider is, then since it's just inherited widgets but easier, then we might as well explain what inherited widgets are. So for this, we'll take an example of a typical Flutter application. So when using a Flutter, you will have what we call a widget tree, which basically looks like such graph. And for example, we will focus on the deepest node of that widget tree, which needs some data that's coming from somewhere. So we will call it B for whatever reason. And so the first way of doing things when trying to pass data around is to use stateful widgets and pass it to the constructor of the different widgets. So in that case, we will have an nested store widget that is stateful here, the widget named A, which keeps a reference to our data. And then it will pass it to its descendants, which will themselves pass that data to their descendants until it reaches the deepest node that needs the data. So this approach is, in my opinion, fine. It has a lot of benefits, like it's very customizable, it's very testable too, or you could reuse every single widget independently very easily. And one of the main benefits, in my opinion, is that it's very safe to use. Flutter and stateful widgets in general comes with a lot of health check that makes sure you're not calling the wrong method or not changing the state when you shouldn't. The downside is that it's very verbose. It's difficult to refactor. There is a lot of code involved. And it's also not very efficient, mainly because if, for example, the data change and we want to update B, then A will have to call setState on the, and we'll have to somehow rebuild the entire widget tree so that B can rebuild. So it may somehow rebuild widgets that doesn't need the data, but that just have to rebuild so that their descendants can potentially use this data. Then we have a different approach that is based on global or singleton variables, which I honestly don't like at all, but whatever. Yeah, it's very simple here. We have a global variable, and since it's a global variable, everybody can access it, including B. So it just accesses it directly, nothing special here. So it's short and simple, everybody can do this. And yeah, the problem is it's very hard to test, it causes issues with testing. It also requires a lot of discipline. While it's easy to write, it's difficult to make it in a way that is maintainable, scalable. It also has no built-in rebuild mechanism or anything built in general. You basically have to do everything by yourself. So it also includes, for example, DevTools. If you want to have a DevTools for your state, you will have to make it yourself. And finally, since you're using global variables, it makes reusing widgets that depends on global variables more difficult. So, all right. So, Flutter doesn't want to use these global variables, but at the same time, stateful widgets have issues like we mentioned previously. So Flutter built something that is called inherited widgets to try to solve these issues. So to use inherited widgets, we would typically have start with the same pattern as previously mentioned with the stateful widget approach, where we have a stateful widget that stores a reference to our data. But then, instead of passing it to the entire widget tree, we will insert a new node in our widget tree that is an inherited widget. And then, the widget that needs to use this inherited widget will be able to directly access the nearest ancestor inherited widget if they need to. And similarly, if we want to inherited widgets in general preserve customization in the sense that if we, for example, wanted to customize the behavior of a specific branch to have it use a different data if we wanted to. We could, for example, add another inherited widgets above that specific branch to override what's the actual data. So yeah, we keep the benefits of the manual approach with stateful widgets that we mentioned previously. It's still testable, still composable, reusable, blah, blah, blah. But it's a lot more efficient because it's a lot more efficient in the sense that we no longer need to traverse the entire widget tree to obtain our data. Obtaining an inherited widget is instantaneous. It doesn't involve traversing the widget tree. So yeah, it's a lot more performant. And it also involves less code on the long run since you don't need to write custom constructors on your different widgets. So yeah, it definitely makes refactoring easier and things like this. The issue is inherited widgets, while they are very powerful, in Flutter they are very low level. And when you want to make an inherited widget, you will have to make all that boilerplate that comes with inherited widget, like the update to notify method and things like this. So you have a big initial boilerplate. And it's also difficult to factorize for some complex reasons. Finally, it also leads to a nested code, because since we're adding a new widget in our widget tree, it also adds a new level of indentations every time we add a new indented widget. And also, it's also quite unusual to use, because yeah, it's relatively unique to the way Flutter works and the widget system works. Also, we could theoretically consider indented widgets as like type systems for a programming language, but instead for service locators. Indented widgets will make service locators more strict and require specific data flow such that your application on the long run will be more maintainable and scalable. Yeah. So the idea with provider is we will take these problems mentioned previously of indented widgets and we'll try to solve them and call it provider. So, all right, that's cool, but that's kind of abstract, you know. So we're here to talk about provider, so let's go on to something more concrete. Yeah. Provider in depth. So we'll try to use provider together. So first of all, we need data to pass around the widget tree. So for this, we'll take a simple class. Here it's immutable. You could use whatever you want to. You could use generifier, streams, whatever. Yeah. Then we have our typical main of Flutter applications, which here currently only creates a myapp widget. And from here, if we wanted to expose an instance of our person class to myapp, then we would simply wrap the widget myapp into a provider. So in this snippet, we can see that there's still the same code that was there before. We just added an extra widget on the top of it. And for the implementation of that specific widget, it consists mainly on a callback called create. This callback will have one goal, that is to return an instance of the value we want to expose. And then the provider will cache this value so that when potentially your widget tree rebuilds, it doesn't cause state loss for some reason. It's also worth noting that recently provider got upgraded to the 4.0.0 version. And with this change, the create callback is now lazily called, which means that before this version, the create function was called instantaneously the moment you inserted the provider widget in your widget tree. While now, it's instead called the first time that you try to obtain the value, which allows some optimization if you want to. Also, if you don't want lazy loading, there is an optional flag available on all providers to disable this behavior. All right. It's worth noting that all objects are compatible with provider. You don't have to use change notifier. Definitely, you can use definitely whatever you want. Even simple classes with setState, for example, will work. And for example, if we wanted to modify our previous example to make it that our class instead may change over time, like depending on Firestore or something like this, we could use, for example, a stream provider to connect to Firestore. It looks basically the same with the create method. The only difference is that the create method returns something different. Here it returns a stream because it's a stream provider. But the actual behavior is the same. In the end, myapp will still be able to access the current instance of the person created. And also, a useful widget is when you work with provider, when you work with indented widgets in general, you may realize that it starts to get very nested very quickly. And it makes the code slightly unreadable. And Provider has a solution for this, which is a different widget called multi-provider. Basically, it transforms this deeply nested architecture into something linear, a simple array. The behavior is strictly the same, but the code is now slightly more readable. You don't have to use it, though. Similarly, all providers comes with the built-in integrations with DevTools. So for example, if you open the DevTools of your Flutter applications, you will be able to see the different providers inside the widget tree. So here, for example, we see the multi-provider and the two providers we created earlier. And finally, we can also expand the informations of this provider. We will be able, by expanding the providers, to read what's the current value exposed. We will be able to get the full details of what's inside our objects. So it's worth noting that not necessarily all objects are compatible to the DevTools. You may somehow get, if you have a custom class, you may somehow find yourself into the situation where the DevTool says instance of my class, where it's not very readable. So there are a few solutions. You could override toString to make it readable, or you could use the diagnostical API of Flutter, which is used to make the DevTool more readable. So yeah, it looks kind of complex. You have to define a specific diagnostic property for each property of your class. It's boring to write, it's complex. There is like string property, int property, iterable property, there are a ton of them. And yeah, so you don't have to worry about this because Flutter also comes with refactoring tools. So you could easily transform any class by simply mixing diagnosticable tree mixing and then click on any property and use the refactoring tool to generate the necessary code for making these properties nicely readable inside the DevTools. Okay, so that's cool, but that's just about exposing values. Now we may want to learn more about reading values. So for reading values, we have a few methods and objects. So first of all, we have provider of, consumer, and selector. Or do we? Because recently there is an upgrade on Dart, the Dart 2.7, which comes with an interesting thing that is called extensions method. And while these methods are working as intended and everything, we could theoretically reduce the boilerplate by using extensions. So Provider implemented some extensions to further reduce the code involved. So instead of printing this, we will instead present an alternative for them. So we have three main extensions that we'll present today. So context.watch, read, and select. So the first one will be watch. We will want to use it when we want to have a widget tree that depends on an object, but that object may change over time. So we may want to rebuild the widget when that data change. So to do that, we will call context.watch. Then we specify the type of the object we want to obtain, which is the same type that is specified on the provider that you used earlier in the talk. And then the watch method will return the current object and subscribe the widget that calls this method with the data, such that when the data changes, the widget rebuilds and everything gets updated nicely. It's worth noting that you can call the watch method as many times as you want, so you can make more advanced widgets by obtaining different objects. there is then another method that is called context.read. And it works the same way as context.watch, but it doesn't watch the object. So it still obtains the current value, but it doesn't make the widget rebuild when that value changes. So one of the main use cases for this is to, like, for example, if you have a click handlers, like with a raise button, you may want inside the click handler to obtain a provider and the value of a provider to call a method on that object. But the raise button itself doesn't depend on the value to display what it needs to render on the application. So it doesn't make sense to watch the value because it would rebuild the button when the value changes for no reason. It's not necessarily, it's inefficient. So yeah, rebuild, the read method will do the same thing as watch without that rebuild consequence. And then finally, we have a third extension that is context.select. So we saw earlier that watch will make your widget rebuild when the value changes. But what we didn't mention is that it observes the entire object, which has a consequence of if you, for example, use only a single property on that object, and another property that you didn't use changes, it will still make the widget rebuild for actually no reason. Because context.watch is not able to know what you used specifically. So here's why we have our little friend select. Select watch similarly works similarly to the watch function, but instead of returning the entire object, it will use a function to select a specific property of, or a specific combination of properties to pass through your widget. So when calling select, the callback will receive the object exposed by the provider, and it is expected to return, like if you use only the name of a person, then the callback should return the name directly instead of the person. Then our widget can use just the name directly as you would expect. It's worth noting that this new API is experimental. It's currently implemented, but it may potentially slightly change depending on before it's released. Yeah. So when continuing, you don't have to select a property specifically. You could select whatever you want. So for example, you could return a string interpolation of multiple properties, and then the widget will rebuild only when the outcome result of that string interpolation changes. So it allows very complex compositions of what you want to obtain while still having a relatively simple syntax. Similarly, you can call select as many times as you want, like watch. So you could directly call it to obtain different objects. Like here, we are obtaining the name of a person and the name of a city, and we are using both inside our widget. So yeah, it definitely allows very granular rebuilds on your widgets. Okay, so now we'll transition onto general questions and tips. So one of the most popular questions by far on provider is how can I rate providers from outside the widget tree without having a build context or a global key? Like for example, we could have a class completely independent from Flutter that is in a separate package that does not depend on Flutter. So we cannot use build context or global keys. And in that case, we may find ourselves stuck, like how do we call context.read if we don't have context? And in fact, the solution is relatively simple. You see, you can just pass the read method to the objects that needs to obtain the value. So for example, our class could be modified to take a function as parameter that will instead be used to, when needed, obtain providers. The difference with passing the build context is that the function is just a function, so it does not depend on Flutter or anything. And then when we want to create our model, we will simply pass context.read. Okay. Similarly, we may find ourselves in a situation where we have different environments in our application. So we may want to change the configurations or mock some services during test or similar things. And one of my recommendations to do that is what the community likes to do is they like to put their providers directly inside the My App widget. The problem with this is when you want to change environment, you will reuse the My App widget because it does extra stuff like creating material app and some theme and whatever. So you won't be able to replace providers with something different. So instead of putting providers directly inside the My App widget, we could put them directly inside our main function. And then we could, if we want to have multiple environments, we could have different mains. So for example, in development, we could have a provider that simply creates configurations objects with fixed values. And then in release mode or whatever we want, you could instead create a stream provider that creates that same configuration object, but based on a JSON object or Firebase or whatever you want. So this way you keep the ability to replace your network services during test if you want to, without losing the composability of providers. Yep. And I think that's it. Yeah, I think that's it. Yeah. Any questions? If needed, I can potentially go deeper on previous topics.
So, thank you for your talk.
Where are you?
I'm here. So, maybe pretty obvious question. So, how provider is compared to block?
As I mentioned previously, provider is a tool, whereas block is more of an architecture. So you could use theoretically provider to implement block. Like there is a library maintained by Felix that is called block, literally, and which depends on provider to implement this library.
So as I understand, so stream provider is somehow can replace the block itself.
It really depends on. In theory, you could do whatever you want with provider. It's like provider is similar to a stream. Like a stream is related to state management, but you could do whatever you want with a stream. It's up to you to decide how to use it. So yeah, you could. It's up to you to decide how you use it.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, hello. I've heard about, I'm fairly new to Flutter. I've heard about provider and it seems very promising, but I also heard about Flutter provider. Can you tell us the difference between provider and Flutter?
You mean provide and provider?
Maybe.
Yeah.
You're the specialist.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Just making sure we're speaking of the same thing. Like mentioned during the Google I.O., make something similar to provider. But actually, by discussing with them, because I also had my package open sourced at that time, so we discussed together and we came to the conclusion that provider is better to use for now, at least. So they kind of gave up on provide. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for a great tool. I use it a lot. Could you explain how you would go about if you need two different providers to talk to each other or share some data?
What do you mean by talking to each other?
I don't know if I'm using it correctly, but if I have some logic in one of the providers and that somehow needs data from another, that's stored in another provider.
You could use widgets to compose providers. Provider comes with a variant of the provider you want to use, which is usually named, like for example, if you use provider, it will be called proxy provider. If you use change notifier provider, it will be called change notifier proxy provider. And the difference with the classical provider is that it also creates the value from other values coming from different providers. You could also theoretically, since like we can see here, wait a second. Oops. All right. I think it's there. Yep. All right. So you see, the function create takes a parameter that is the build context. So in theory, you can use that context object and call context.read to obtain other values if you want to.
Okay, thank you.
Hello, thank you for the talk and for the time you spent building this library. My question is about the extension. I found it very cool, but very scary at the same time. And I want to ask you why you choose to, let's say it in this way, overload the context. So this, makes me feel like I bind my app with providers a lot in this sense, because since the build context is something that Flutter itself provide, and then you are overloading that methods with extensions, what happens if I want to remove provider, for instance?
To be honest, I don't really fully understand the question, but if you're speaking, if you mean that the read and watch method are something directly built in context, they are not. There is no existing method named read and watch and something like that in build context. So by using this, you're not actually overriding the behavior of build context. It stays.
No, sorry, maybe I expressed myself wrongly. Not like kind of overloading, but you're like extending on it, no? Because they are extensions. So you build context. Now we'll have a method read that you implement by extending, no? By
No. Extensions methods use the word extension, but it doesn't involve extending the class build context. It's actually just syntax sugar for functions that doesn't depend on anything. Like for example, you could have a function that takes the build context as parameter and do something, and instead, when using extensions method, you can refactor this kind of functions into fake method where instead of taking the build context as a parameter, it's then this. But in the end, it's still just a static function that doesn't depend on anything.
Okay, I understand. Thank you so much.
So now that it's here, now that Google recommends your library, what is your working relationship with Google? Do you see pull requests from them? Any suggestions what to implement?
We speak sometimes. Yeah, that's about it.
So no contribution, no financial support for your work or something
No.
like that. Okay. Okay.
Any other question?
Hi.
Hi.
What's on the roadmap? What's Provider 5.0 going to look like? Do you have an idea?
What the future provider would be?
Right.
Currently I can't think of any possible breaking change for a provider, so I'm not sure we will necessarily have a 5.0 in the near future. On the other hand, like we've mentioned before, we may have 4.1 relatively soon with the extensions, and it's also likely that there will be some sort of official packages to combine provider with other libraries, like for example Mobex, which wants to use provider a lot. You may want to have a specific libraries that simplify the usage for Mobex specifically. It wouldn't necessarily change provider directly, but it would be like in the community of provider.
Great, thank you.
Any other question?